to human infrastructure. These on the left, these are both are close to my home in the middle of the city. So on the left-hand side is a greater short-nosed fruit bat. And you will often see telltale signs of the fruits that it has eaten and dropped. And they are very good dispersers of fruits and seeds throughout Bengaluru. And on the right-hand side is a grey hornbill, making use of an electrical transmission tower in a very different manner. So some species of biodiversity in Bengaluru or in other Indian cities have adapted. So we just need to give them a little bit of, we need to be a little more tolerant and give them a little bit of habitat, and they can adapt quite well. So these are barn owls. Barn owls perform a very important service by devouring rats and bandicoots. As you know, we have a lot of solid waste, including food waste, and that has led to a big population of rats and bandicoots. We need barn owls. And barn owls, they do screech at night and they disturb some people. But if we are able to tolerate a little bit of that, compared to the shouting and screaming that we do as people, I don't think it's much of a problem. But even then, in some places in Bengaluru, people have complained about the barn owl screeching at night and so on. So this is something that we have to foster in children, to tolerate, to appreciate, and to live with a species which is not going to be doing much harm to them in any way. So these are the chicks, and again, the barn owl. Okay, I just want to point out one thing. There are 3 species of owls here. There's a barn owl here. On the top, you have the spotted owlet. Some of you who came for the biodiversity walk this morning may have seen the owl box that we have on campus. And on the bottom right, you have the scops owl, collared scops owl. Now, all 3 owls require slightly different types of habitat. The barn owl can actually live in apartment buildings and tall buildings and so on, because it can find lots of rats around and it can just needs a safe ledge to nest in and so on. The spotted owlet is sort of in between. It can live on campuses with some buildings and so on. The scops owl at the bottom, that requires slightly larger wooded campuses, like the University of Agriculture Sciences campus, and places like that, slightly larger green spaces in Bengaluru. And all 3 species of all these photographs I took within a couple of kilometers of each other. So it's not that they're very far from each other, just the habitats are very different. So these are things that we can teach children about how each species has its own requirement in terms of habitat and foraging and life cycle. And this is, will lead to a tremendous experiential learning in biology and ecology. And there are some species which are much closer home, like this purple-rumped sunbird, the tailor bird, and so on. So very easy for us to bring biodiversity and ecology into the curriculum of children very early in life. This is a shikra hawk, again doing quite well in the middle of Bengaluru. On the right-hand side is a kestrel, the Eurasian kestrel. Those of you from Europe would also recognize that. Unfortunately, the one on the left, the shikra, can adapt well to urban areas. The one on the right, the kestrel, requires open places, open spaces to hover over. So this was taken just outside our campus, and even though we will try our best to provide habitat for as many species as we can on our campus as it develops, the areas around our campus are going to change. And so inevitably there will be some losses of biodiversity as the campus develops, but we hope to get back some of them through innovative ways in the future. So these are some of the things that we can do on small campuses, balconies, gardens, is to give a little bit of helping hand to nature to thrive. So on the left, you have what is known as a bee hotel for solitary bees. We have 2 of them on our campus. There are about 52 locations across Bengaluru where our friends and collaborators in A-Tree have installed these bee hotels for solitary bees. Solitary bees are very important for pollinating many fruits and vegetables. They're completely harmless, and so perfect to have around. In the middle, we have a roosting box for insectivorous bats. As you know, insectivorous bats devour hundreds of thousands, millions of mosquitoes every evening. And so they are very important for pest control, not just of mosquitoes, but also of flies, as well as agricultural pests. So living safely with bats in the future is going to be an important part, and bats do reasonably well in urban areas as well. about 12 to 15 species of bats, including 2 fruit bat species we have. And on the right-hand side is the spotted owlet in our own campus. Some of you, 6 of you who came this morning to see, came for the biodiversity walk, may have seen this nesting box. And it was colonized very soon. So these are some nature-based solutions for fostering biodiversity, providing a little bit of additional habitat just to compensate for the loss of other areas. On the left-hand side is what is known as this is a butterfly kit. This has got 3 to 4 species of plants, some to provide nectar, some to provide the host plant for the butterflies, and they can be put in any garden, any balcony, and this is again distributed in Bengaluru. It's available, and the basket itself is made with lantana, which is an invasive species, so the good use of that material. So this is again something that we can have in our schools, is to develop a butterfly garden, and so that the entire life cycle of the butterfly comes alive in front of kids. So this is the Shikra hawk again, and this I'm showing you because I took this photograph yesterday morning while I was going for my walk. So this is still doing well in parts of Bengaluru, and it's a very fierce hunter, and it eats a lot of smaller birds and rodents and all that. And this is again, yesterday afternoon, I got this photograph just outside my house. This is the greater short-nosed fruit bat. This is, again, a purple drum sunbird feeding on an exotic bottle brush. So as long as the exotics are not invasive species, we are okay with that, although we would like to promote native species in the future. This is something that I think we need to teach as well. This is my colleague Ravi Jambekar's sketches of all the invasive species which are found on our campus. Again, very important to tell children the difference between exotic, native, and invasive species and how it interacts with different plants and animals. And so these are very simple to identify, and every school can have a butterfly garden. It can have a sort of a watch list of invasive species and native species, exotic species. All of these are very easy for us to teach. About invasive species, we as citizens should have the responsibility of ensuring that we don't deliberately introduce invasive species into the environment. Many of us have aquariums. Many of us try to keep exotic species at home. This is a red-eared slider. It doesn't belong in India. It's from the United States. It has proliferated in all urban ponds and many other lakes, and it has displaced many other native species of turtles and all. So one thing that we can teach children is not to release exotic species of fish or turtles or anything else into the environment. And that's a huge problem. The damage to the world economy through invasive species is now estimated at about $123 billion annually. So this is our campus there, our long-term urban ecological observatory, where we want to integrate food, water, ecology, energy, sustainability in all of these as a place for learning. You are one of the largest groups you are the largest group that has come to our campus, so we're very proud that you are here. And I know that many of you have appreciated what has been done so far, and we are hoping that we will be able to meet the challenges of the future in terms of fostering sustainability in the city and elsewhere. And I just want to end here. We are in leopard territory, so we have about 3 leopards visiting our campus, including a leopard with 2 cubs also in the past. But I just want to say that probably one of them must have come last night as well. So we have about 8 camera traps on campus which capture our nocturnal wildlife. Living with some species of wildlife in urbanizing areas is a huge challenge. Leopards are one of them, and we hope to learn from some of the good and bad experiences from places like Mumbai and elsewhere. And we hope that both leopards and people can keep out of harm's way in this landscape. So thank you, and over to Neha now.
Thanks. Thank you, Jagdish. I don't have pretty pictures like Jagdish did. But thank you all very much for having us. It's actually, it is really a pleasure to be here also because I come from a family of Montessori educators, so it is actually really wonderful to be here. So I think just building on what Jagdish said, there are a few things that I'd like to kind of open up for discussion, whether later today or as you go back to your classroom environments. And I think these are more to think a little bit about how we can, as educators, being educators ourselves, start to think a little bit more holistically about bringing some of these processes and systems into the classrooms. And I think the one thing that I would encourage all of us to think about is to think of sustainability not as a goal, but a process. And I think it's really, really important to think about it as something that is constantly ongoing. It is part of a larger approach to not just teaching, but to be able to inculcate in as a way of life. And I think that's something that's really, really important to understand, because all of us tend to think of them as short-term solutions or quick fixes. And a lot of this damage has been created over many, many, many centuries, and I think it's necessary for us to think of it as something that we start fixing slowly and over time. And I think that's something to keep in mind, is that it's not something that we can attain immediately. And there are 2 or 3 different aspects of this process that I wanted to kind of offer you to think about. One is to think of it as not just something that reflects in curricula or in the classroom, but something that cascades across the entire education ecosystem. And so to think of it as, as ourselves, not just as educators, but as administrators of learning spaces, as, people who integrate into larger, sort of processes beyond the schoolroom itself. And this includes, the kind of people that you work with as suppliers. It includes, bringing parents into the room. It involves, sort of expanding that pool of people who you interact with and sort of bring into the fold. And so it goes beyond just the teaching and learning materials and the content of the curriculum that you use in a classroom. And so I think that it's, for example, to think a little bit more, with specific sort of illustrations, if we think about the way where our food comes from, right? Jagdish spoke a little bit about, thinking about the impact on urban agriculture. But I think it's worth considering and worth kind of thinking about the purpose of urban agriculture as being beyond actually just supplying us food, because we know that, urban populations cannot be self-sufficient on what we grow ourselves, but to think of it not as a source of food supply, but as a learning and teaching technique, which allows us to bring, both children and parents closer to our food growing processes, to understand where it comes from, the effort that is involved, and in some ways inculcate a certain amount of respect for those who sort of grow and supply food for us. So, and that becomes a part of a larger chain. So to think about urban agriculture not just as spaces for pollinators and urban biodiversity, but also to open up the conversation around what it means to actually have somebody who's doing this for us, and so to in some small way, the way of sort of, when you grow it yourself, the amount of effort that is involved in actually sustaining an urban garden, in sustaining sort of local food supply chains is something that can actually be taught a lot by osmosis rather than being something that's kind of, rammed into your head in a school classroom. So I think it's worth thinking a little bit about how we inculcate these kinds of things and think of it beyond just immediate environmental impacts, but to think of it as a way of kind of changing perspectives in some ways. And I think that brings me to my second point, is that it's one thing to actually teach it in the classroom, but I think that it's even more, and as we're trying to do here on campus as well, it's really critical to be able to practice it on a regular basis, even if it is not to a great extent, because even if the impact of growing our own food, for example, may not, supply our meals, at least it's sort of a way of saying, look, you're doing this, there's a certain amount of effort involved, and it needs to become part of our way of looking at things. It needs to become part of the way in which we learn to interact and integrate with sort of other ecosystems and environments around us, and not just be very sort of human-centric. And I think that there are ways in which to think about expanding this up and inculcating that into practices that are daily practices in school. So for example, things like monitoring water supply in the buildings, which we do, and it's quite inexpensive to do nowadays, and it's to be able to teach both parents as well as children, because I honestly do think that some of this has to be cascading across different aspects of children's lives. It can't just be something that they learn in school and then they don't actually see happening in other aspects of their lives as well. So I think it's really important to think of it as part of a larger system of kind of education and change and transformation that we're able to cascade across. So simple things like turning the tap off, small things like understanding how much water supply is being used and how much of it is fresh, how much of it is recycled, what are these things, what can they be used for, and these are things that we can actually implement on campuses as well. There are many fairly cost-effective options that are now available to us to be able to integrate into the working of, from small homes all the way to larger campuses. Another example is that of sort of decentralized and off-grid energy systems. That's setting up small solar panels, setting up little windmills to be able to talk about the importance of generation of clean energy. And I think these are all things that are in small ways kind of can be integrated into both teaching spaces as parts of curricula, but also on school campuses themselves. I think that it's important also as kind of not just educators, but as administrators to take calls on who we work with. And this is sort of even beyond the school system itself, and to think a little bit about where our supplies are coming from. So, and to try and not necessarily, I mean, I'd like to illustrate this with the example of sort of the label of organic. So, for example, a lot of people who, the value of, the label organic is sort of valorized a lot nowadays, but the cost to the grower of actually, getting the label and continuing to sustain that is immense. And so, to think a little bit about the kinds of processes that go into it. And so, even if there are local farmers who are using near organic practices, it's worth considering supporting those kinds of networks and systems through because campuses are actually among the largest consumers of resources as well, right, in urban spaces. And to try and think of ourselves as these kinds of consumers and what is it that we can do as people who live and work on campuses to actually green our own, supply chains, to green our own processes. I think that the third thing that I want to kind of mention a little bit is how to integrate some of this into the curriculum, into teaching. And, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of, sort of children's fiction, there's a lot of sort of, a lot of other teaching and learning aids that are now available that allow us to engage very young children all the way to sort of older kids who can sort of understand the kinds of challenges that they themselves will unfortunately have to deal with as they grow. But I think part of it is also to think a little bit about what kinds of knowledge we valorize. And I think that there are large kinds of sort of indigenous, local value systems and knowledge